Well, we are going to go ahead and get started. So keep enjoying the food. I hope you have met someone new today. You are attending a Faith Driven Entrepreneur Luncheon. We do 4 of these a year. And the goal of these luncheons is to gather folks who are on the grind. You might have your own business. You might work for a startup. You might be a freelancer. You might be none of those. But our goal is to have you here, a chance to lift your head up from the work you're doing every day, to meet other folks that have a shared worldview as you, and to hopefully leave encouraged in the work you're being called back into. Faith Driven Entrepreneur runs under the nonprofit in town, Chattanooga Faith Work Culture, and our mission is to equip Christians to be agents of kingdom renewal in the places God calls you to be, your job, your family, your neighborhood, and the community here of Chattanooga. And so we want to provide resources for you to be encouraged in that work that you're doing. If you've been to any of our Faith Driven Entrepreneur events in the past, normally we have a little conversation where I interview someone and they tell us a story about what they're doing locally here in town. Today we have a special treat though. Dr. Michaela O'Donnell, who is the Executive Director of the De Pree Leadership Center at Fuller Seminary in Pasadena, California, is here today to share with you not only a story of who she is, a little bit about her background, I'm sure she'll give you a little bit of that, but really the work that she's doing to support you all as entrepreneurs, the research that they've done, the data that they've collected from a theological perspective about how do we have a theology of work in light of being an entrepreneur? What does it mean to be an entrepreneur and flourish in light of your faith? And so she's coming today, less of a conversation and more to share some information with you. And I hope as she's talking, that you can begin to think about your context. What's the work that you're going to be called back into? What are the pain points you're feeling? What are the things that you're bringing with you into the work every day? And how can what she's saying translate to your context? Each of you, that's going to look different. And so I hope individually you get that, but 2, I hope you've met other people here that are on the journey with you. That can be connections that you leave with. Hopefully you leave with a few business cards, some new people to get to know. We want this to be a community that grows together for the sake of our city in light of the work that we do. Oftentimes we think that we have to check our faith at the door when we go to work 9 to 5. But we want to say, what does it mean for us in light of our faith to do good work in the world and in the places God calls us to be? So I'm excited to have Dr. O'Donnell here with us today from the Max De Pree Leadership Center. If we could give her a round of applause for being with us.
Okay, yeah, get comfy, get comfy. Hi. I've already gotten to meet so many of you, interesting people. Those of you I haven't met, my name's Michaela. It's so good to be in Chattanooga. So I actually went to college just, let's see if I got the right direction, up the road in Cleveland, that way. Somebody redirect me. I think I got it. All right, thank you. So it's been a long time, and it's good to be back in the land of Southern accents. My husband tells me, I'm from Nebraska. I do not have a Southern accent by nature, but somehow when I am in the South, yeah, thank you. I get a Southern accent, so it just happens. And so here I am with my Southern accent, and it's good to be here. So first of all, Jonathan, if you don't know him or if you're just getting to know him, I get to travel around and speak with people all over the country and get to work with leaders who are doing faith work stuff all over the country, and y'all have a serious gift in him. He's so, his vision for the city, his sense that the secret sauce is y'all and the relationships that y'all develop, it's really special actually. So just got something really good here. Okay, so like Jonathan said, I am the Executive Director of the Max De Pree Center for Leadership. Anybody know the name Max De Pree? Okay, a couple. All right, so Max De Pree was longtime CEO of Herman Miller, office furniture company based in West Michigan. The probably most famous designs to come out of there are the Eames chairs. And they really popularized mid-century modern and really the workspaces and offices and what that looked like in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and continuing on here in the States. Max was also longtime chair of the board at Fuller Seminary. And so about 25 years ago, a seminary of all places, a place that's supposed to train pastors, and along the way, we thought about missionaries and psychologists. It was like, okay, how can we help support and make more Max De Prees? People who are out across industries, living out their faith and work. I think that's pretty cool, right? And very different for a seminary. So people ask me a lot, okay, you run a leadership center, you work with church leaders. I'm like, actually, no. I get to work with business leaders and nonprofit leaders and people in higher education. And so that's just a little bit. We really believe in the spiritual formation of leaders. That's what we're doing, right? Leveraging the resources of a seminary for the sake of people's like Tuesday, or today's a Tuesday, for the sake of people's Tuesday. And so we have different cohorts and like daily devotionals and just all these resources that help people with their sense of spiritual formation. Because we think that spiritually formed leaders are what help make a redemptive impact in the world. That's our theory of change. That's what I do. A lot of my, so I have a PhD in practical theology. A lot of times people are like, what is practical theology? Shouldn't all theology be practical? It's its own discipline. And there's like systematic theology, which is like, what are all the big ideas of our faith? Biblical theology, what does the Bible say and how do we learn from that? All these different theological disciplines are about starting points, by the way, right? It's just where you start, we all intersect. Practical theologians are like, what's happening in the world right now? And how does theology and the Bible and the history of Christian tradition speak into that? So I'm a practical theologian, and I'm also an entrepreneur myself. It's like how I'm built. I had my first lemonade stand when I was 8 years old, and I knew how to pitch for clients before I ever knew how to make a resume, right? That's how I'm wired. I come from a family of entrepreneurs in the Midwest, and that's sort of the water I was raised in. So a lot of my work then as an academic has been at the intersection of faith and entrepreneurship. It's what I did my dissertation on. It's the foundation of a book I wrote called Make Work Matter, which is way less dissertation-y and way more practical nature. But that's kind of where I spend my thinking time. So today, I really actually just want to encourage you. I'm going to present some different data and frameworks, and my guess is that even if you've never heard it, it's going to feel kind of intuitive to you in a good way. Like, oh wait, hey, there I am. I am of the belief that when the world feels upside down and when disruption is at its highest, it is a moment for entrepreneurs, right? It is a moment for people who exist outside the structures, and when things aren't necessary, it's okay, we actually like the chaos. We want to navigate our own way forward. So if you are a person who sort of thinks, yeah, I kind of actually would prefer to navigate my own way forward, or maybe because of structures and systems and the way life's worked out, I'm kind of forced to navigate my own way forward in work. The entrepreneurial skills, this is for you, okay? And the question I just want, it's exactly what Jonathan said. The question I want you to hold today is, as I'm talking, is how is this thing that I'm gonna call the entrepreneurial way applicable to your own work? Does it resonate? Are there points of contrast? Is there an idea that you saw show up yesterday, or that made sense of that conversation you had 2 weeks ago, or kind of informs how you want to think about a meeting that you're going to host tomorrow, okay? So let me tell you a little bit about the research project and the Road Ahead groups. So I graduated seminary in 2011, and my husband, I met him at seminary, he graduated in 2010. Anybody remember what was happening in the economy in those years? Yeah, it was bad. It was not pretty. And so we had theology degrees, which, as it turns out, is not a very marketable skill in a recessed economy. And so we were there peddling our theology degrees to people who were on hiring freezes. And we were living in Los Angeles, and rent was expensive, and we had student loans. And my instinct, coming from the family of entrepreneurs, was we've got to start a business. That's the only answer here. We've got to literally make our way because nobody else is making it for us, all right? So we started a business, my husband and I, called Long Winter Media. My husband's an artist. He's just he's literally over there at a coffee shop. He's I'm working on this, I'm finishing this talk. He's like, Michaela, I can't crack the code on this video. I'm like, okay, yeah, I know you'll get there. So he's an artist, and I'm the business person. And so we started a business where we served a lot of different clients in helping tell their story, making videos, doing brand identity work. We were literally selling projects that we didn't quite know how to do, that we had to work our way into because, again, hello, rent, right? After several years of this arrangement, I had a few mentors back at Fuller say, Michaela, we think you have some gifts for the church. We think you should come back and do a PhD. And I was like, no, I'm not going to do that. Like, I learned my lesson. Theology degrees do not make money. I don't think so. And I did something that I actually don't usually do, and I certainly don't endorse, and I'm not recommending with God. I was like, okay, God, if you want me to do this, like, you gotta pay for it. Like, I'm not going into more debt for a degree. And so I ended up with a full ride scholarship. Okay, I was like, oh, that doesn't usually happen at this place that's sort of not doing well financially, so I'm gonna take that as a sign. And I went back, and I was running our business full time. Our business was growing, and I started to work on my PhD, and then we found out that we were expecting our first child, right? And all of a sudden I was like, okay, this is too much. Like, I got too much on my plate. What am I gonna do? Again, school is gonna go. Like, it's just the thing where there's margin. And I went into my advisor's office, and he said, Michaela, see if you can make school and work the same thing. And I didn't really know what that meant, and I didn't really know how to do that, but I felt like that was my job. Like, I went on a quest to figure out how to do that. I had a lot of other friends. We had a lot of other friends that were like us, that basically had went to grad school or had done undergrad and found themselves really far from the meaningful work they wanted to do, and they were like just trying to put the pieces together. So as I got close to my dissertation, I started to wonder, okay, what if I could study people like myself, and if the church could actually help form people who are in crisis vocationally? Like, what if we could do that? And then, because of my own bias and inclination and like homegrown spirit, I was like, the church needs to teach people to be entrepreneurial. That's what the church needs to teach people to do. I'm like, okay, I don't know how that would happen or what that means or even what I mean by church, but that was my instinct. So then I went on a quest, okay? I went on a quest to see if I could figure out what the formative practices of Christian faithful entrepreneurs were. Like, what were the things they were actually doing, and could somehow those lessons be transmitted to a larger audience, all right? Let me go back a slide. So in 2018, when I was finishing up that work, I got a call from my then boss, now colleague, named Mark Roberts. I think a few of you know Mark. And he said, hey, Michaela, I had somebody call me on the phone and wonder if we could do something. And we had like literally had coffee. We didn't really know each other. He calls me out of the blue. Hey, Michaela, there's a foundation that wants to do something at the intersection of faith and entrepreneurship. Do you think that we could do something? Do you think that maybe you could pitch something? I was like, I don't know if I want to do that. And he's like, Michaela, this is a chance to see if you can convert your research into resources for real people. And I was like, okay, I will take that bait. Let's see if we can turn the research and data into resources for real people. So my big idea was to start these like vocational incubators that would help people become more entrepreneurial, all right? Yeah, people want to be more entrepreneurial. So I signed up this group of like 6 or 8 people, and they all showed up. And it took me exactly 3 minutes to realize none of them were there to become more entrepreneurial. That's like, they didn't care about that. That's not what they were there for. They signed up for it. It was like on the paper. That's not what they wanted. What they wanted were other people. What they wanted was rest. What they wanted was to ask big questions of meaning and purpose around other people that sort of thought like them. So then I had a decision, like, okay, am I gonna force these people to become more entrepreneurial, or am I gonna do the entrepreneurial thing and build toward the need, right? We did one of those groups in 2018. This year we did 25 of those groups. Yes, exactly, like scratching an itch. We've come to realize that it helps people move from stuck to unstuck professionally. Now here's the thing, like they're doing the entrepreneurial stuff. We just don't call it that because that's not the felt need. So what I'm gonna introduce y'all to is some of like this process. And I think, again, you'll see yourself in it, all right? It's a research question. I asked for lots and lots of recommendations, like who should be in the study, who should we look at? I got about 50 exemplars that I talked to, 50 exemplars that had met a bunch of different criteria as I outlined it under what it meant to be successful. And it was usually a couple of different metrics: people, finances, on mission, things like that. I asked them a ton of questions, most of which were not helpful, actually. I asked them a lot of questions and I had all this data and I was like, okay, this is not, I don't actually care about this. But I asked them 4 questions that ended up being game changers, okay? And here's the 4 questions. How have you learned to define success? How have you learned to define failure? What practices have moved you towards success? And what practices have helped you deal with failure? Okay? Yeah, screenshot that. Spend a little time with that. Like, spend a little time with those questions. Maybe we'll do it at the end, but I don't think we're going to be able to do it. Okay, so here, I'm waiting. I'm patiently waiting. Okay, all right, got it. Okay. So here's some of the initial findings, okay? I'll name them here and then we'll go into each one in depth. I learned a lot, and eventually my team, as I came to work at the De Pree Center and then eventually came to lead the De Pree Center, learned a lot about the relationship with success and failure. There was this whole thing that came up about ways of being, and then the practices. That was my initial question, and like there was just some really interesting stuff that came up, okay? So first, relationship with success and failure. Remember the question, like, how have you learned to define success? There were exactly 0 similarities between people's definition of success. And that is really important. Success is very contextual, very, very contextual. Like, yes, maybe there are some similarities in that people are like, okay, profits and people and mission, but I'm telling you, the way they described it was very contextual and very different. The second thing is the way they talked about success and failure. I'm thinking about this woman, and she started something that scaled to be present in 185 countries. I'm like, oh, that's pretty good. Yeah, 185 countries. She had been given an award by a president, okay? Yeah, I'm like, oh. And then when I asked her, like, how have you learned to define success? She's like, I don't actually know if I've been successful. And part of that is, I think, the visionary struggle, right? You always see beyond like where you are. And part of it was a sense of, like, this work is never going to be done. And so it was less of, oh, I can't like point to some objectives and milestones that we hit, or oh, I'm so obsessed with progress that I can't be present in the future. That's an unfolding picture, all right? When I ask people about failure, I remember I did a lot of these interviews. Actually, I did them on Zoom before Zoom was like, the thing we all did. I asked them about failure, and every single time the same thing happened. I asked them second, and it was this. Oh, yeah, I can tell you about some times that like it didn't go right. I can tell you about some times that I fell flat on my face. I can tell you about some times that we tried things and it just did not go. Here's what we learned. Here's why it's fine. Here, like, just this real comfort, actually, and I would say a relationship with failure that just became very apparent. So much so that subsequent conversations after the official research, I could tell in talking to someone, if I have a couple questions that I ask them about different things, and immediately I can gauge, like, oh, you're a person that's comfortable with failure in a healthy way, like you're probably actually achieving a lot of interesting things. And oh, we can't go to the failure space. Oh, that fear of failure is probably holding you back, right? So this is success and failure. Okay, ways of being. This is not, like, I think if you went and looked at any of the literature on entrepreneurship, you'd see this stuff. But I started to get really excited when these ways of being, and another way to describe the ways of being sometimes are like these muscles, right? It's just like, it's less about, I have this practice and I did this specific thing, and more about, this is how we show up in the world, right? And when I saw that creative, resilient, and relational were rising to the top in the early data, and then like started to work that out in relationships with people, like the theology nerd part of me, which is, like, I'm a nerd. I started to get really excited. Because I was like, creativity, like, hello, that's our first story about God. Genesis 1, like made in the image of God, to be creative and to, be in the world and fill it with arts and artifacts. Resiliency, like, hello, that's the climactic story in Christ, right? And we, like, nothing that we ever do will ever be permanently undone or be marked by failure, because we have the promise of resurrection. So, like, we are grafted into resilience. And then relational, and I can see it in this room and you can feel it, just that entrepreneurs, particularly these Christian entrepreneurs, are very powered by relationships. And that's like, okay, hello, the church, the best version of it, right? Not the worst version of it, but the best version of it. Okay, then there's some practices, okay? Empathy, imagination, risk, and reflection. I'll tell you a story here of one of the people in particular. Her name's Jessica Jackley. She is the founder. Anyone ever heard of Kiva? Is it microfinancing? Yeah, okay. To date, they've given over like $1.5 billion in loans, largely in the denomination of 25 US dollars. So that's a lot of loans to a lot of entrepreneurs around the world. And when I was asking Jessica the story of how she started Kiva, I saw these practices and this rhythm play out in a way that then moved into kind of the process I'll show you in a second. And don't worry, we'll have to like Q&A time after this. Jonathan will come back up and I'll talk at you and then we can talk together. She said, Michaela, I was on a development trip. I was working for an NGO and I was sent out to capture a lot of stories. And to be honest, I was told to capture stories that were sad and that pulled on heartstrings. And she said, that's what I did. Like, that's why I was there. She said, but Michaela, that's not who I was meeting. That's not at all who I was meeting. I was meeting people with a lot of dignity that had a lot of great ideas and only lacked access to capital. That's who I was meeting. Empathy, right? This capacity to like notice each other, to feel each other. So then she described, like, I thought to myself, what if I told these stories instead, right? What if I matched these people with these very business-centric ideas with just my friends and family back home and saw if we could like give some loans and give some income, whatever. And she said, so then, and that's the imagination, right? Imagination sounds a lot like what if. And as Christian people, like we have the opportunity to think about imagination as like, okay, that's the hope of what God promises. Like when we see those like sparks of redemption, right? That's the sort of redemptive imagination. She's like, what if I match these people? And she said, so then I did. I actually took out my camera and I took out my pen and I took out my email list and I took pictures of people and wrote their stories and sent them to my friends and family. And she said, you know what happened? I was like, what? She said, within 24 hours, like everybody was funded. And it was like $3,000 funding round. And she said, but then I saw like the potential, right? And so she takes this risk, right? She takes this risk. She doesn't know yet, are these $3,000 going to be paid back? How's it going to go with these businesses? Every dollar was paid back. Of course it was, on time or early. And they went from like $3,000 funding round to $50,000 funding round to $500,000 to like millions, right? And so they didn't start at giving $1 million away. She started with an email list and a storytelling abilities, a camera, and the people who were right in front of her, right? And so the reflection comes in because she said they built in order to go to that pace, like this regular rhythm of being able to say like, what happened, how'd it go? Should we keep doing that? Should we go left and right? Which is very entrepreneurial. So over time, I came to put these like into a method. And this is the method that then is part of these groups that I described that we do 25 of a year. And let me talk about it a little bit. Okay, so one thing that's interesting, and we'll keep using Jessica's story, so it's not just that entrepreneurs practice empathy, it's not just that they listen well, it's that they practice empathy on the way of where they're already traveling in life, right? It's this ability, she's already going, she's already moving. She's not saying, okay, I want to start a new business. Let me start a formal, listening project. Let me figure out all the needs. No, she happened upon a need, like right in front of her. She's practicing empathy along the way. We know empathy takes different forms. Cognitive empathy, the ability to like understand in your mind what's going on with someone. Emotional empathy, like the ability to feel it. And then this empathetic concern, right? The ability to sense what another person needs from you and actually take action on it. But then here's the thing. it's not just that entrepreneurs empathize, it's that empathy becomes fuel, right? Fuel for imagination. And you convert the empathy into imagination. This is the what if questions, right? And then you let that imagination fuel risk-taking. And over and over and over again, both in the research and then in subsequent, both in the Road Ahead groups that we do and in lots of conversations, like, okay, so I'm from Nebraska, recently moved back there after 20 years away in Los Angeles. So also you can just pray for me. Lots of adjustments happening between my husband, me, and our 2 kids. But we have the same, we talk in farm idioms, which I didn't even realize until I got married. And my husband's like, did you grow up on a farm? I'm like, no, I did not. He's like, why do you talk about the farm all the time? I'm like, I guess that's what we do in Nebraska. So we have this saying in Nebraska and other places where you talk about like bet the farm kind of risks, right? This is like the go all in, like you just gotta like go for it. Most of the time, that's not what these risks are. These are the small, little, like day by day, like I'm gonna lean into a person, I'm gonna, send out an email, I'm gonna like write up someone's story, just things that are much smaller. And usually, like you can start with the resources you already have. So this is not like I need to go get more capital or a bigger team or a building. It's like the chef that starts cooking out of their kitchen, right? Just right there. And then after risk reflect. I think that the after risk reflect is like sometimes the best and the Achilles heel, right? It can be my Achilles heel. It's like, oh, did I slow down? The people that I respect most, the entrepreneurs I respect most, have built in systems and processes around reflection. It doesn't always just come. It's like, and then we did this, and then we got feedback, but you can tell it's really built in, okay? So that's sort of the process. Now, this is a process that plays out in the passage of the Good Samaritan. Okay, so story of the Good Samaritan. Somebody tell me what's happening in the story of Good Samaritan. This is like Bible pop quiz, but no pressure. There's like, you can't go wrong here. What happens in this Good Samaritan?
You got a hurt man.
Yeah.
Attacked and robbed.
You got a hurt man who's attacked and robbed. Then what happens? Someone else comes along and sees him. And what does he do? What does the person who comes along and sees him do? Takes action, like in very specific ways, right? Takes action in very specific ways. So this, yes, and very good. You all passed Bible pop quiz. Like you can like rest easy. You did great. You can tell your mamas you did great. The story of the Good Samaritan, yeah, you've got somebody who's like let's go back to this. You've got somebody who's like in a bad way on the side of the road, and then you get the story of some different people who pass by. You get some people who, oh, by the way, are at the center of society, people who have fancy religious degrees or status, who just go on over to the other side, right? And then you get the Samaritan, who probably is not at the center of economic and social life, who is also, by the way, on his way from some point A to point B. This is a traveling road, and yet he practices empathy along the way, right? And then I have to imagine there is like this internal monologue. I'm projecting here, but an internal monologue in the head of the Samaritan that's like, should I go over there? What should I do? Like, can I help him? Is it risky? Are there other people hiding? Like, what if I helped him? What if I like brought him with me? There's all these what if questions, right? That empathy is sparking imagination. And then he takes action. Like he actually goes and he takes an enormous amount of risk. First, by like using his own resources, oil and wine, to bandage wounds. Then says like, okay, like I'm gonna put this guy on my donkey, which now means that he's walking alongside him, going slower on an already vulnerable road, all right? And then he gets into town, and does anybody remember what happens when he gets into town? What happens? Yeah, he pays for him to stay at an inn. So he enters into an open-ended financial relationship with a stranger and says like, I'll come back and settle his debt in a minute, right? And who knows that took? And then he goes back, right? He goes back. And so like I have come to notice that this cycle, this entrepreneurial way, is present everywhere. 2 other people. So I've got a 7-year-old and a 3-year-old. They're little. Last year we were in kindergarten. I was new to school. We had parent-teacher conferences for the first time. They were on Zoom because, hello, like Los Angeles, COVID. And so we got on Zoom and we have this 15-minute slot. And I had a lot of questions. I had all these things I wanted to know from the teacher. And instead I started I practiced humanity and said hey, how are you? And my daughter's kindergarten teacher said, I'm not good. I'm not good at all. And then in my head I was like, well, I've got all these questions that I want to ask, but I probably should set those aside. And so I'm going to do a follow-up. Why are you not good? And she's like, to be honest, this was March. And she said, to be honest, Michaela, it's March and I've still got 4 kids who don't have friends. She said, I know. She said in kindergarten, this is usually handled in November, March. They said COVID was done and it was going to play out, but it's not. And so then I said, well, what are you doing about that? How does that shape your day? And she leaned in to whisper to me. She was in a room by herself. My husband and I were not with anybody else, but she still leaned in to whisper because her response was so subversive in the system. And she said, you know what I did? The other day we're on the playground. And I started to see little seedlings of this happen. And she said, so I canceled math. And I said, oh, okay. And then I canceled language arts. Oh. And Michaela, we just played all day. And then we played the next day. And then we played the next day. And so she, practicing empathy along the way, these little kids who don't have friends, imagining, what if I cancel the subjects I'm measured by? What if I measured my work and my worth and my choices by something else? Okay, I'm going to do it. I'm going to cancel a subject and see how it goes. Nobody's looking. Nobody's scolding. Parents seem to be okay. Afterwards, I decided that was a good decision. I'm going to keep doing it. This rhythm plays out, right? One other story, Paul, he's a project manager. So if my daughter's kindergarten teacher deals in reading lessons in child emotion, Paul deals in Excel spreadsheets and due dates, right? And he said, he's like, Michaela, the more I've been thinking about this, I feel like it's in my work. I'm not an entrepreneur, but it's in my work. I said, how so? And he said, there's a lot of systems and I'm not really in charge of anybody, but I'm responsible that they all adhere to the project pace and rate that we're going at. So I got to get a lot of people to do things that I actually can't tell them to do. I'm like, ooh, that sounds like a hard job, Paul. And he said, yeah, and nobody was using the software that we implemented. Absolutely nobody was using my Excel spreadsheets. Nobody was using Asana. Nobody was doing these things. He said, and then I thought to myself, what if I learned why? What if I learned why? Practicing empathy along the way. And what he heard is that people were confused. And so what he did was he scaled down the system. He took out all the bells and whistles, presented something that was very building blocks. He thought to himself, what if I rebuild the system? Not what if I bring these people to do what I need them to do, but what if I go to them, right? What if I go to them? Took risks. Within 90 days, people were using the systems. After reflect, the productivity was up, the bosses were happy, all because of this cycle, okay? One more thing. I told you that we started Road Ahead, and that people were coming in because they had a lot of stuff that they were working through. And at first, we were having them do the entrepreneurial way. It was good. We weren't calling it that. And then we realized, oh my goodness, entrepreneurs build around pain points. This is the empathy, right? What if we gave people space to name their own pain points, and then the flip side of those pain points, which is longing, right? Our deepest, most human desires that our pain reveals. And then what if we practice empathy along the way, did imagination, risk-taking, and reflection in light of pain and longing? And I firmly believe that's why we did 25 groups this year. I firmly believe that space. And so I give you those different examples just to say the entrepreneurial way, and I'll read this last thing to you, and then I'll invite Jonathan up and we can do some Q&A. At the heart of what it means to be a faithful entrepreneur is to be a good neighbor. That's the Good Samaritan stuff. To notice opportunities and steward our resources toward them for the sake of God's kingdom. And this happens whether you're an entrepreneur or not. And so as entrepreneurs, we can both find ourselves in that cycle. There's probably a lot of things I said that you're yeah, I kind of do that. That makes sense. And we can look to the kindergarten teachers, the project managers, the Good Samaritan, people who maybe don't have formal businesses, watching this rhythm play out in everyday human life, and be encouraged to go back to our work as neighbors, okay? Okay, that's all I got. We'll bring Jonathan up. We'll do some Q&A.
Let's thank Michaela for sharing. All right, we want to open it up. If there's things that Michaela talked about that resonate or things you want her to go into a little bit more, we'd love to give you the opportunity to ask those questions. We got a few minutes left to do that. We want to be respectful to get done right on time, but if you have a question, we'd love to. Yeah, Lane.
So help me understand a little bit more about the road ahead. You described this road ahead. What is that?
Yeah, great question. Great question. So it's a programmatic output of this research at the De Pree Center for Leadership. It's a 6-week cohort, and we market it specifically to people who are in vocational transition, because that's all the folks that were coming. But here's a little bit of a spoiler alert. Certain people that were coming, we're like, oh, actually, you're not. We've gotten so clear on our value and our value proposition and what we're actually doing here that certain people apply for it, and we're like, this isn't going to be a good fit for you because of the way we've done the pain and the longings. And what we've realized, especially over the last 18 months, is people are just tired now. They're tired. They've been spinning too many plates. They feel like their own sanity, I was talking with someone this morning at the breakfast, their own sustainability is at risk. And so we're piloting right now a partner, a sister cohort called Go the Distance. And it's all about renewal and refreshing in your own sense of vocation. So it's a spiritual formation 6-week experience that we do with leaders across the country. So unlike the amazing embodied work here, we're at a national level. And so we somebody's in Houston, Texas, and New York City, and San Francisco. So that's just a little bit more. We can talk more if you have more questions. Yeah, it's a great question. It is, how have you learned to define success? And so many times it used to be this, but now it's this. And the change, to be completely honest, usually came through like heartache and pain and tough stuff and failure. And it was like, I realized because it didn't go well and because I had to pick myself up off the floor, that stuff that I thought was really important actually wasn't as central, right? And so there are lots of evolved definitions, and the catalyst for that kind of evolution was usually through pain and even crucible moments. Yeah. Which I know is not like a warm, fuzzy thing to say. Just like preview of coming attractions, I shared this morning, we're doing, the project we're doing right now is on healthy leadership. What does healthy leadership look like across industries? And we did 18 focus groups this winter. We're doing exemplar interviews right now. And all of this amazing stuff is coming out about like the kind of leaders we need for the coming age. And another spoiler alert, the leaders who have worked to integrate their own pain and suffering are like the leaders that we need in the future, because so much is changing, so much is destabilized. Grief is actually one of the #1 skills that we need. But as we know, and as artists show us the way, the flip side of grief, or what is both, kind of can be an output of it in some circumstances, is actually creativity and innovation. So like leaning into the tough stuff, both because we're human and we need to, but trusting, and this is back to the Christian faith, that new life comes after death. Like there's a relationship there.
Talk a lot about the importance of empathy.
Yeah.
What are some practices that you have seen that you think help cultivate empathy, sort of in either things that are obstacles to empathy, I guess things that are barriers to that, or that what might be some personal practices that also sort of cultivate that in some of your research?
I'm so glad you asked that question. So I'm a person who's had to learn empathy. So any Enneagram people in here? Okay, I'm a 7, so I like to like keep it light and like don't think about pain and like don't do the stuff. And I am married to an empath, and my daughter, her like superpower is empathy. So 7 years ago when she was born, I went on a journey of realizing like, oh, I have to change in order to like parent well, in order to fulfill this particular calling. So all kinds of things, right? Like I don't think that, I'll speak very personally, like that I have been able to really feel concern for others and like go there before I have like my own stuff figured out. So there is this like self-reflection part. The other thing though is like as simple as listening without talking. And being able, actually at Lee University, wow, I never get to say this, at Lee University, Patty Silverman, who knows if she's still there, but she was my communications professor, and she said something that will stick with me. She's like, most of us are just waiting for our turn to talk, and we actually don't listen well. And so there is this like very basic practice of when someone else is talking, you're listening enough to when they've got done talking, you can sort of say, Jonathan, I think what I've heard you say is X, Y, and Z. And literally the simple act of then saying, tell me more. Like you just start going places with people. And so listening without responding, telling more, you just start hearing a lot more, which is an important first step to being able to cultivate in yourself and letting others help you cultivate actually caring about what you're hearing. So I would say start with wherever you're at, becoming a better listener. Yeah.
We have time for one more question if anyone has one.
So how do you use your system personally in what you do?
How do I use it personally for what I do? Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. It's in, I'll talk about a lot of ways, but right now the place where I'm using it the most is I manage a distributed workforce. So my team with part-time people is 25, not a huge team, but enough in a distributed workforce to like manage it, 8 full-time people. The kinds of conflict that come up in a distributed workforce are just different, and you can miss each other so easily. And I can say things that come with the weight of direction and leadership that sometimes I've got to back it up. So I like literally, and now it's very instinctual now, but like I will, like when something happens and something doesn't quite go, like for example, the other day, we're having a board meeting and one of my teammates, her son, she's given a report to like fancy board, and her son came in, who's sick from school, and he's like, Mom, where is this? And like, she just like, was so like embarrassed, you know? And afterwards she texted me and was like, I'm so sorry that happened. I was like, don't worry about it, he's a kid. Okay, that was actually not an empathetic response. And so later I went and I'm like, I bet that felt awful. I need to actually, like, it's not about how I think the moment went or what really it's about how she felt in the moment. So I followed up and I was like, you know, I bet that felt like this. I really heard that in your text, and like, let's get a call, we can talk 10 minutes and whatever. And she wrote back and she's like, thank you so much for leaning into empathy. This is how I felt. And so the conflict resolution, going back with my team, wondering that's how I'm using it right now. It's a great question.
Michaela, thanks for sharing with us. One of the big takeaways for me, just hearing you talk and when I read the book, is how closely tied what it means to be in a relationship with others is to success in work. That I can't define something without something helping me to find it, and usually that's brothers and sisters that walk alongside of me. And it's kind of scary to think about, a lot of what you talk about was doing internal work, of like actually knowing yourself. And this is where I'm so thankful for the gospel, right? It's like, we have the freedom to do that internal work, because even when we see the dark parts, when that's brought to light, we have a Savior that's already gone before us in that dark space that allows you to walk in there to become a better leader, because it's not, we were talking about this earlier, it's not coming from a place of you earning that leadership. Colossians 2 says that we have our fullness in Christ, and that our leadership comes as overflowing with gratefulness. And so when what you just described wasn't a bunch of tools around how to be a better entrepreneur. It's around how to be a person that finds their identity in the right things. Thank you for sharing that with us in really succinct ways. So I hope you are left with something that you have a takeaway from today, I hope you can share it with someone at the table with you. I hope that this is someone that you're sitting by that maybe you're going to get coffee with at another point. We want you to feel encouraged in the work you're doing, and can imagine what we could do as a community of believers in our city if the work we did redemptively, we did together for the sake of others, like we talked about today. Thank you for being an encouragement to us in the work we do here in Chattanooga, and thanks for the work you do all over the country for leaders like us here in town. So thank you.